There was one thing on that old Tennessee farm that didn't belong. Everything else was as you'd expect, peeling paint to sagging porch weeds where the driveway used to be. The barn had stood for 100 years and looked every bit of it, but the padlock on the barn door was brand new. Dorothy Calloway noticed it the moment she arrived, a 72-year-old retired nurse with 44 years of marriage behind her and $47 in her pocket. Her children had taken the house. They had taken the car. They had emptied the savings account her husband spent a lifetime building. They left her this farm because they thought it was worthless. They were wrong. Her husband George had driven 4 hours to Tennessee 3 weeks before he died, sick, exhausted, running out of time, and changed that lock himself. He hadn't told her why. He hadn't told anyone. But he had left her the key. Dorothy Calloway had checked 1,000 pulses in 38 years of nursing. She knew exactly what absence felt like under her fingertips. She found George at 3 in the morning. Not collapsed, not dramatic, just still in the way that is different from sleep and unmistakable once you have seen it enough times. The television was on. His coffee sat on the nightstand, still warm. She reached for his wrist, the way her hands had reached for 10,000 wrists before his, and she held it, and she already knew. She sat beside him for a long time before she called anyone. The funeral was on a Thursday. 312 people came, men. George had worked with neighbors from the street they'd lived on for 26 years, families whose pipes he had fixed at midnight and never overcharged. Dot stood at the door of the church and thanked each one. Her feet ached by the second hour. She stood anyway. That was the kind of thing you did. You stood. Raymond arrived 3 days later. He called it a family meeting, which should have told her something. Family meetings, in her experience, were for scheduling holidays and discussing who would take the dog when everyone traveled. They did not typically require a folder. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. The round oak table she and George had bought at an estate sale in 1987 for $60, the table where they had drunk coffee every morning for 31 years, where the grandchildren did homework, where George used to sit with the newspaper, long after newspapers had become unnecessary, because he liked the feeling of the pages. Raymond set his folder on that table and opened it with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. Lily was on the phone speaker, on her voice coming through thin and careful from Portland. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, Mom." Raymond laid the first document down. The house. George had added Raymond's name to the deed 11 years ago after his first cardiac episode. Raymond explained a practical decision about estate planning. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. When one owner dies, the property passes automatically to the other. No probate. No delay. "So the house is yours?" Dot said. "It transfers to me, yes. That's how joint tenancy works." She looked at the document. The language was precise and dense and technically correct. She had spent her career reading charts, not contracts. She understood individual words. The architecture of them together was harder. The car. Titled in Lily's name, George had done that 18 months ago, Raymond said, because he wanted Lily to have reliable transportation. The savings account. Moved into a trust 2 years prior. Raymond was the trustee for asset protection purposes. Protection from what? Dot asked. Probate, creditors, complications that come up when estates aren't structured properly. He said it evenly, the way he said everything. Dad was thorough. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Dot sat with her hands flat on the table. The oak was cool under her palms. Outside the window, the backyard was visible in the late afternoon light. The flower beds she had planted every spring for 2 decades. The fence George had painted white the summer he retired, and the wooden chair he had built from a kit the year Raymond was born, still sitting in the same spot by the garden, slightly weathered, facing the yard, the way George used to face it. She looked at that chair for a moment. Then she looked back at her son. "Is there anything left?" she asked. Raymond checked the last page of the folder. Something moved across his face, not discomfort, exactly more like a brief recalibration. "There's a farm property, Millhaven, Tennessee. Dad inherited it from his uncle years ago." He said it the way you mention a footnote. "The county's been sending notices about back taxes, $9,000 approximately. The assessed value is less than what's owed." A pause. The kind of pause that is doing work. "It's not really worth pursuing." Dot looked at him. "I'll take it," she said. Raymond glanced up. "Sorry." "The farm, I'll take it." Lily's voice came through the speaker. "Mom, there's nothing there. Raymond said the house hasn't been lived in for—" "You said it belongs to me," Dot said. "So I'll take it." Neither of them argued. She noted that the absence of argument. They had taken the house she had lived in for 26 years, the car she drove every day, the savings account she and George had built together over 4 decades. The farm was a liability, a debt, a punchline. They let her have it without a word. Raymond gathered his documents. Before he left, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with something that was almost warmth. "Dad wanted me to take care of you. That's what he wanted most." She looked at her son, his jaw, his posture, the particular way he stood in a doorway that was George's way exactly. She thought about George's coffee on the nightstand, still warm. She thought about 38 years of reading people, of knowing when something was wrong before anyone said it. She believed him. She was tired. Grief does that. She stood at the kitchen window after he left and looked at the wooden chair in the backyard. George had built it the year Raymond was born. He had sat in it every evening the last summer of his life, facing the garden, not talking much, just present. She did not cry. She thought, "I'll be fine." That was the mistake she would spend the next 4 months paying for. The farm at Millhaven was exactly what Raymond had described, old, tired, and barely worth the drive. Dot had rented a car at the Columbus airport because her car now belonged to Lily. She noted this the way she had once noted symptoms on a chart. The car is gone, this is the fact, what comes next. She did not spend time on the feeling of it. Feelings were not useful at 72 miles per hour on an interstate going south. 4 hours. Ohio giving way to Kentucky, Kentucky to Tennessee, the land flattening, then rolling, then flattening again. She drove with both hands on the wheel, the way George had always told her to, and arrived at Millhaven just after 2 in the afternoon. The county road ended at a gravel drive nearly invisible beneath 2 seasons of weeds. She turned in anyway and drove slowly, the rental car brushing overgrowth on both sides until the farmhouse came into view at the end. 2 stories. Wood-framed. The paint had gone from white to gray in the way of things left untended, not peeling dramatically, but fading, surrendering gradually, the way some people did near the end. One corner of the roof showed a dark stain where water had found its way in. The porch held. The windows were intact. The yard was a tangle of goldenrod and late-season thistle gone to seed. It was exactly what Raymond's voice had suggested when he said not really worth pursuing. The tone of a man describing something already dismissed. She got out of the car and stood in the gravel. Wind moved through a gap somewhere in the roof timber, a low, intermittent sound, almost like breathing. She pulled her jacket closed and walked toward the house, then past it, because something behind the house was asking to be looked at first. The barn. It had stood for 100 years and looked every year of it. The siding was weathered to the soft gray-brown of driftwood. The roof sagged slightly at the south end, and the hinges on the secondary door had rusted to the color of old blood. One wall had a long diagonal crack running from the eave to the foundation, the kind of crack that had been there long enough to become part of the structure. But the padlock on the main door was brand new. Dot stopped. She stood 10 feet away and looked at it. Bright steel, no rust, no weathering, a hardware store purchase recently installed. The hasp it hung from was new too, the screws still sharp at their edges. Someone had not just bought a lock. Someone had come here, removed the old hardware, and replaced it with this. She walked closer. The cold of the folding metal chair she'd brushed against the night before was still in her fingers. She pressed her palm flat against the barn door, now against the old wood, and held it there. The planks were dry and firm. Whatever was inside had been kept dry. She walked the perimeter, slowly pressing her hand to each wall as she passed the way she had once walked a ward, at the start of each shift, not looking for anything specific, just taking inventory, letting the space tell her what it knew. She was on her second pass when a man came through the fence line, 68 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the deliberate movements of someone who had worked outside every day of his adult life. He was carrying 2 folding chairs and a thermos. He came through the gap in the fence as if he had done it 1,000 times, set both chairs in the gravel without asking, and poured coffee into the thermos cap. He held it out. "You must be Dorothy," he said. "George talked about you." She took the coffee. The thermos cap was warm against both palms. The coffee smelled of October, and something darker chicory, maybe the kind her grandmother had made. "Walter," she said. "Walter Osei. Next property over 20 years. He sat in the second chair and looked at the barn the way people look at familiar things, not studying it, just resting his eyes there. "George said you'd come eventually." A pause. "He said you'd look at that lock first." Dot looked at him. She did not ask how he knew her name. She had spent 38 years in rooms where the most important information arrived sideways, offered by people who were waiting to see if you were ready to receive it. She recognized the posture. She sat in the other chair and drank the coffee. "When did he change the lock?" she asked. 3 weeks before he passed. I watched him from my kitchen window." Walter turned the thermos slowly in his hands. "He drove down alone. Didn't tell me he was coming. I saw his truck in the drive and went over to say hello, and he was here at the barn with a drill and new hardware working slow because he wasn't moving well by then." He paused. "I asked if he needed help. He said he had it." "Did he say why?" "Not exactly." Walter looked at the lock. "He said if anyone came asking about the barn before you showed up, I should tell them it was empty. Nothing here worth seeing." He turned back to her. "But if you came when you came, he said, when I should tell you to go in." The wind moved through the roof timber again. Somewhere in the overgrown yard, a bird called twice and stopped. Dot looked into the thermos cap. The coffee was still warm. Someone had been paying attention. Someone had been paying attention for longer than she knew. "He also said something else," Walter said. He said it quietly, the way people say the thing that matters after the things that were easier to say. "He said you'd know what to do with it. Whatever's in there. He said you'd know what to do with it better than anyone." Dot sat with that for a moment. 44 years of marriage, 38 years of nursing, a rental car in the drive, and $47 and a farm that wasn't worth pursuing. George still believed in her. He just couldn't say it out loud anymore. She finished the coffee. Walter took the cup back without making anything of it, the small practiced courtesy of someone who understood that some moments didn't need comment. "Do you have a key?" she asked. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and held out a small brass key on a plain ring. "He left it with me. Said to keep it until you came." She took it. The metal was cool and slightly worn at the bow, the kind of worn that came from being handled regularly. George had carried this key. He had held it the way she was holding it now. She closed her fingers around it and stood up. George had changed that lock 3 weeks before he died. Walter had watched him do it, and George had said nothing to either of his children. She called Lily from the front seat of the rental car because she didn't want to go inside the dark house alone. Not yet. The farmhouse sat 20 yards ahead, its windows black, the porch light long since burned out. Walter had gone back through the fence line after she took the key quietly, without ceremony, the way he seemed to do everything. The gravel drive was empty. The barn stood behind the house in the last of the October light, the new lock catching it faintly. She found Lily's number and pressed call. Lily answered on the second ring. Not the third. Not after a pause. The second, the way you answer when the phone has been sitting in your hand. Mom. Her voice was careful. It had been careful since the diagnosis, since the treatment, since the Thursday of the funeral. Careful in the way of someone choosing each word before setting it down. How is it down there? Different than I expected, Dot said. She looked at the barn through the windshield. The lock was a small bright point in the dimming light. The barn is locked, she said. George changed the lock before he died. 3 weeks before. Silence. Not the silence of someone hearing new information. The silence of someone deciding what to say next. Dot had spent 38 years in that silence beside beds in hallways, in the particular quiet of rooms where families were working out what they could and could not say. She knew its texture. Lily, she said, did you know anything about this farm? Raymond handled all of that, Mom. I wasn't involved in... I didn't ask about Raymond. A pause, shorter than the first. I didn't know the details, Lily said. I wasn't part of those conversations. Wasn't involved. Not didn't know. 2 different sentences. Dot looked at her hands on the steering wheel. The small brass key was in her jacket pocket. She could feel the slight weight of it. Your father drove 4 hours by himself, she said. He was in the middle of treatment. He came down here alone and changed a lock on a barn and didn't tell me he was going. She kept her voice level. The voice she used when delivering news that required steadiness from the person receiving it. I'd like to understand why. The silence this time was longer. Mom! Lily's voice had changed, the careful register slipping into something underneath it, something that had been waiting. I think you should just go in. Go look at whatever's in there. I think that's what you need to do. What do you know, Lily? I don't know what's in the barn. I genuinely don't. That's not what I asked. The line was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the last of the light was leaving the fields. The goldenrod had gone gray. The barn was a shape now more than a structure. I heard Raymond mention the farm once, Lily said finally. Her voice was smaller. About 2 years ago, he said Dad had something down there. Something he needed to figure out before... She stopped. Before your father died, Dot said. Yes. Dot sat with that. She waited. She had always waited for the lab results, for the doctor, for the thing people were working up to saying. She had spent a career learning that waiting was not passive, that it required more from you than talking did. But Lily didn't finish. I'm sorry, Mom, she said instead. I should have, I'm just sorry. Sorry for what, exactly? Dot understood that Lily would not say. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. Get some sleep, Dot said. I'll call you tomorrow. She ended the call and sat in the car in the dark. I wasn't involved was not the same as I didn't know. She had listened to people not say what they meant for 38 years. The difference between those two sentences was not subtle. It was the difference between a closed door and a locked one. Her youngest child knew something, and had chosen silence. That was a different kind of loss. She knocked on Walter's door at 7 in the morning without rehearsing what she would say. The night had been long. She had slept in her father-in-law's old bedroom on a mattress that smelled of cedar and disuse under a quilt she found folded in the closet, and she had lain awake for most of it, listening to the house settle around her, the particular language of old timber adjusting to temperature, the wind finding every gap it could. At some point before dawn, she had stopped trying to sleep and simply waited for the light. Walter was in the side yard feeding chickens when she came through the fence. He looked up without surprise. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. She followed him inside. The kitchen was warm and unhurried, a cast iron pan on the burner, a radio playing something she didn't recognize at low volume, the particular smell of a house where someone had been cooking since early morning. She stood at the counter and drank the coffee he poured without sitting down. "I need to open the barn," she said. "I don't have a key." Walter set the coffee pot back on the stove. He dried his hands on a dish towel, reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, and held out a small brass key on a plain ring. "George left it with me," he said. 3 weeks ago, same day he changed the lock. Said to keep it until you came." She took it. The metal was cool and slightly worn at the bow, handled enough times that the edges had softened. George had carried this, had held it in the same way she was holding it now, in this hand, on some afternoon 3 weeks before the end, when he had driven 4 hours by himself to do something he needed to do before he ran out of time. She closed her fingers around it and set her cup down. The lock opened on the first try. The door swung outward on its hinges, heavy, slow, the movement of something solid and well-maintained. She pulled it the full width and stepped back. Morning light fell across the interior in a long rectangle, catching the dust that rose from the threshold. No equipment. No tools hanging on the walls. No rusted machinery. No feed bags or fence posts, or any of the things a working barn accumulated over a century of use. Instead, wooden shelving units along 3 walls, floor to ceiling, each one built with the careful precision of someone who expected them to hold weight for a long time. And on every shelf, arranged in an order she could not yet read, canvases wrapped in white cloth. Dozens of them, more than dozens. She walked in slowly. Her shoes were quiet on the concrete floor. The air inside was cool and dry, not the damp decay she had expected, but something controlled, preserved. She ran her hand along the nearest shelf. The wood was smooth, the joints tight. Someone had built these recently. Someone who knew what they were doing. She counted the shelves along the first wall, then the second, then the third. She stopped counting. She reached for the nearest canvas, the one closest to the door, the one the morning light was already touching, and lifted the cloth. An oil painting, roughly 2 feet by 3. A Tennessee hillside in late October, the light coming in low across a ridge, amber and dense. The brushwork was confident, the color layered in the way of someone who had done this long enough to stop being careful and start being sure. She turned it to the light. Lower right corner. Small letters, careful and unhurried. G. Calloway, 1987. She read it twice. George. Her George. The man who fixed pipes and drove the same truck for 16 years and fell asleep during the second half of every movie they had ever watched together. The man who made the same 3 jokes at every family dinner and laughed at them every time as if he hadn't made them before. G. Calloway, 1987. She turned the canvas over. On the back in his handwriting, the slightly right-leaning script she had been reading for 44 years, a small label, Tennessee Ridge, October. First try at this light. Might go back. She had been 33 that year. George had been 36. They had a mortgage and two small children and a car that didn't start reliably in cold weather, and not enough money at the end of most months. She remembered that year clearly, the particular exhaustion of it, the particular love of it. He had been painting. She walked the shelves. She lifted cloth after cloth, checking the labels in the lower right corners: 1979, 1983, 1991, 1998, 2004, 2011, 2017. Year after year, decade after decade, the same careful signature in the same corner of each canvas. She walked back to the first painting and stood in front of it. Walter was in the doorway. She hadn't heard him follow her. He stood at the threshold with his hands at his sides, not coming in, not speaking, understanding the way he seemed to understand most things, that this moment had a shape, and that shape required him to stay at the edge of it. She looked at the painting, the light on the ridge, the amber of it, the patience of it. 44 years. And she had not known. Outside, a bird called once from the tree line. The barn was quiet. She held the canvas in both hands and did not put it down for a long time. By the second afternoon, she had counted 247 paintings and stopped counting. She had started on the morning after opening the barn methodically, the way she had once started every shift, moving from left to right, along the first wall, before the second, before the third. Nothing skipped and nothing rushed. She brought the small spiral notebook from her purse and wrote down each one, the date from the signature, the subject as best she could describe it, any notes George had left on the back of the canvas. Tennessee Ridge, October. First try at this light. Stones Creek in February. The water was low this year. Field behind Walter's property, early June. The light only lasts about 20 minutes. 40 years of noticing. 40 years of driving 4 hours to stand in a barn and pay attention to things most people drove past without slowing down. She worked through this morning without stopping. Walter brought coffee at 9 and left it on the workbench without interrupting her. She drank it cold an hour later and kept going. The subjects were mostly landscapes, the particular Tennessee light she was coming to recognize across decades of his work, the way he returned to the same hills and creek beds in different seasons, as if he were having a long conversation with them. A few portraits loosely rendered an older man she didn't recognize sitting on a porch, a child at the edge of a field, a woman seen from behind, standing at a window. Dot paused at each of those. She did not always know who they were. That was its own kind of grief. Not the grief of losing someone. The grief of realizing the full size of a life you thought you already knew. Walter came back in the early afternoon with sandwiches and sat beside her on the concrete floor, his back against the shelving unit, the way two people sit when there is no hurry and no performance required. They ate in silence for a while. Then he said, "There was a man who came here once, about 10 years ago." Dot looked at him. Dark blue BMW. Pulled up to the gate on a Tuesday morning, I remember, because I was fixing the fence post on that side, and I saw him arrive. Walter held his sandwich but didn't eat it. George went out to meet him. They stood by the gate for a long time. 40 minutes, maybe more. The whole time George had his arms crossed. "That wasn't like him," Dot said. "No, it wasn't." Walter set the sandwich down. The man drove away. George came inside the barn and closed the door. I didn't see him again until after dark. He paused. The next morning he came over to my place. First thing, before I'd finished my coffee. He said, "If anyone comes to this property asking about the barn, anyone at all except Dorothy, I want you to tell them it's empty, nothing here worth seeing, and then call me." The barn was quiet around them. Outside, a truck moved along the county road and faded. Did you know who the man was? Dot asked. Not then. Walter looked at her steadily. George kept a photograph on the kitchen windowsill. Family Christmas, I think. I recognized him from that later. Raymond. She said the name in her mind, but not aloud. Raymond had come here 10 years ago, had stood at the gate while George crossed his arms and said whatever he said, had driven away in his dark blue BMW, and the next morning George had called Walter over before the coffee was finished and begun quietly building a wall. George had known. George had prepared. George had not told her. She understood it, the logic of it, the fear underneath it. George had spent his whole life handling things quietly, without announcement, without asking for help until the last possible moment. He had built the shelves alone. He had driven down alone to change the lock. He had called Walter over before the coffee was finished and given instructions he trusted a neighbor to keep better than he trusted his own son. He had just not told his wife. She held that for a moment without judgment. Then she stood up and walked to the far corner of the barn. She had noticed the floorboard on her first pass, the way one plank sat slightly higher than the others, the way the shelving unit in that corner had been positioned 6 inches from the wall, instead of flush against it, just enough clearance to reach behind and down. She had noted it and moved on because she was counting, and not yet ready for what else the barn might hold. Now she was ready. She moved the shelving unit forward on its feet. It rolled on the smooth concrete. George had put casters on the base and crouched behind it. The floorboard lifted with the pressure of a flathead screwdriver from the workbench. Beneath it, a fireproof metal box, gray, the kind sold at every hardware store in the country, for keeping documents safe from the ordinary disasters of a house. It was locked. She reached into her jacket pocket for the key ring, the one she had taken from George's belongings in the days after the funeral, because she could not throw it away. She had been wearing it on her wrist for 3 months, like a loose bracelet, the small brass key, and 2 others she had identified, and one she had not. She had assumed it was a padlock key for something she hadn't found yet. A storage unit, maybe. A toolbox. She looked at the small brass key. She looked at the lock on the box. She tried it. The lock turned on the first attempt. Inside a sealed envelope with her name on the front in George's handwriting. A folded document she didn't open yet. And a business card slightly bent at one corner from being placed at the bottom of the box, Claire Ashworth, Attorney at Law, Nashville, TN. On the back in George's hand, 4 words. She's been waiting. Call. Dot sat back on her heels and held the business card in both hands. He had known the danger was coming. He had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, methodically, without announcement, trusting that the right person would eventually find the right door. He had simply run out of time to tell her any of it himself. But he had put the key in her hands. At the very end, when he could not explain, and could not protect, and could not do anything, except the one small thing that remained, he had made sure the key was in her hands. She had worn that key on her wrist for 3 months, thinking it was just something George carried. It had been a door. It had always been a door. The number on the back of the business card rang twice. Mrs. Calloway. A woman's voice, calm and unhurried, the voice of someone who had been expecting this call and had decided not to be surprised by it. I've been waiting to hear from you. Dot was standing at the workbench in the barn, the business card in one hand and her phone in the other. Outside, the October light was going flat and gray. How long? She asked. 11 years, the woman said. Your husband retained me in 2013. He's paid an annual retainer every year since. His instructions were to wait until you contacted me directly and not to reach out first unless there was an immediate legal threat to the property. Dot set the business card down on the workbench. 11 years. George had been paying someone to stand watch for 11 years through his illness, through the treatments, through everything, and had never mentioned it once. "I need to understand the situation with the will," she said. "Yes." Claire Ashworth's voice was precise and unhurried. "I'll explain what I can now, and the rest in person, if you're willing to come to Nashville." A brief pause. "The will Raymond presented to you is dated 2021. It's a valid document. It bears your husband's genuine signature and was properly witnessed and notarized. But," Dot said, "in March of 2023, 6 months before your husband passed, George came to my office and executed a new will. He was of sound mind and not under any observable distress at the time of signing. 2 members of my staff witnessed it." A pause. "Under Tennessee law, a later will supersedes all prior wills provided it meets the formal requirements. The 2023 document meets every requirement. It is the controlling instrument." Dot stood very still. "What does the 2023 will say?" "The house and savings accounts go to you outright. The Millhaven property and all its contents go to you outright." Claire's voice was careful and even. "Raymond receives a specific cash bequest, a modest amount your husband designated separately. Nothing else." The barn was quiet around her. 247 canvases on their shelves, each one wrapped in white cloth, each one waiting. "Raymond knew this will existed?" Dot asked. "Your husband told him a new will had been drafted. He did not share the contents." A brief pause. "Raymond would have known the 2021 version was not the final word. He would have been counting on you not finding the final word." Dot looked at the sealed envelope on the workbench, her name in George's handwriting, the envelope she had not yet opened. "He was almost right," she said quietly. "Mrs. Calloway." Claire's tone shifted, still professional, but something underneath it, now something that had been held back for 11 years and was finding its way to the surface. "Your husband talked about you. Not often and not at length because that wasn't his way. But when he did, he was very clear about one thing." A pause. "He said you were the most capable person he had ever known, and that the only thing he was genuinely afraid of was that you would trust the wrong people because you had spent your whole life trusting the right ones." Dot stood at the workbench with her hand flat on the surface. The wood was cool under her palm. The same sensation as the kitchen table in Columbus the night Raymond had laid his folder down, but different now. This was her workbench in her barn on her property. "There's something else," Claire said. "George left you a letter. He wrote it here in my office the same afternoon he signed the 2023 will. I've been holding it for 2 years." A pause. "I think you should read it in person. Some things are better received that way." Another pause, shorter. "Can you come to Nashville tomorrow?" Dot looked at the business card on the workbench. She looked at the envelope beside it. She looked at the rows of white-wrapped canvases on their careful shelves. 247 paintings, 40 years of her husband's quiet attention. All of it waiting for exactly this moment. She thought about Raymond's folder on the kitchen table. The tone of his voice when he said not really worth pursuing. The way he had let her take the farm without argument, because he had calculated correctly almost that she would never find what was inside it. Almost. "I'll be there in the morning," she said. She hung up and stood in the barn for a long time without moving. Then she walked the perimeter, once her hand trailing along the shelving units, touching the edge of each wrapped canvas as she passed. The way she had once walked a ward, at the end of a long shift, checking that everything was where it should be, that nothing had been lost or overlooked. Everything was where it should be. She turned off the barn light, locked the door with the brass key, and walked back to the farmhouse through the dark. She would drive to Nashville in the morning. She would read her husband's letter, and for the first time since the day he died, she would know the full truth of what he had been trying to protect and why he had not been able to tell her himself. Claire Ashworth's office was on the third floor of a narrow building 2 blocks from the courthouse, small, organized with the particular neatness of someone who understood that details were the difference between outcomes. A single window faced the street, 2 chairs across from the desk, a shelf of law books that had actually been read. Claire herself was younger than Dot had expected, late 30s perhaps. She had the steady manner of someone who had delivered difficult news before and understood that the way you delivered it mattered as much as the news itself. She placed a sealed envelope on the desk, Dot's name on the front, George's handwriting. The same slightly right-leaning script she had been reading for 44 years on grocery lists, on birthday cards, on the notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter when he left early and didn't want to wake her. "I'll be outside," Claire said. "Take all the time you need." She closed the door behind her. Dot sat alone. The envelope was standard letter size, sealed with tape rather than glue. George never trusted. Glue said it dried out and failed you when you needed it most. She turned it over once, set it flat on the desk, looked at her name in his handwriting for a long moment. Then she opened it. 7 pages, handwritten in blue ballpoint, the same brand she had given him a box of 12 one Christmas as a joke, because he was always losing them, and he had laughed and kept everyone. The early pages were written in his usual hand, steady and clear. She noticed without yet reaching them that the later pages looked different, smaller, more compressed. She began to read. "Dorothy, I'm writing this at Claire's desk because my handwriting is worse at home these days, and I want you to be able to read this clearly. She's given me as long as I need. I've already been here 2 hours, and I'm only on the 2nd page, which tells you something about how hard this is to say. I'll start with the painting because that part is the simplest. I started in 1979, the year before we met. A friend in college painted, and I tried it, and found out I had some ability for it, which surprised me more than anyone. When we got together, I didn't mention it, not deliberately, I just didn't know how to introduce it. It felt like something that belonged to an earlier version of me, and I didn't know if that version fit with the life we were making together. Then years went by, and the longer I didn't say it, the harder it became to say. By the time the boys were small, I had a room full of work I'd never shown anyone, and showing it felt like confessing a secret I'd kept past the point of easy explanation. So I kept it longer and longer. I drove down to Millhaven most months. I told you I was going fishing. You packed me lunches. You never questioned me. That was a kindness I didn't deserve and never adequately thanked you for. The handwriting changed on the 4th page. Smaller, tighter, the script of someone whose hand was tiring, but whose intention was not. Now the harder part. Raymond came to Millhaven in 2013. I had been speaking with a gallery in Nashville, not to sell, only to understand what the work might be worth. Someone there mentioned it to someone they shouldn't have. Raymond arrived unannounced on a Tuesday. He didn't ask about the paintings. He asked about the land value, the tax situation, what my plans were for the property. He was thorough and careful, and I understood exactly what he was doing. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to put you in a position of choosing between your son and your husband. I thought I could handle it quietly. I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry. What I didn't prepare for was Sasha. In November of 2022, you remember how that month was. The 3rd round was the worst. Sasha came to the house alone. Raymond didn't know. She had a document with her, a will she had arranged herself, and she told me that if I didn't sign it, she would tell Raymond everything about Millhaven, and Raymond would find a way to take the property before I died. She knew I was afraid of that. She had watched our family long enough to know precisely what I was afraid of. I signed it. I was tired and frightened, and I was alone that afternoon, and I signed something I should never have been asked to sign. That is the thing I am most ashamed of in my life. Not the secrecy about the painting I can explain, that even if the explanation isn't good enough. This I cannot explain. I was a man who had spent 40 years trying to protect something, and in one afternoon I handed it over because I was too tired to fight. 3 months later, when I had enough strength back, I came to Claire, and we made the 2023 will. The correct one. The one that says what I actually want. I didn't tell you any of this because I believed the legal structure would hold, and you would find the barn, and find Claire, and everything would be in order before it became necessary. I thought I had fixed it. I thought you would never need to know how close I came to losing it for you. I was protecting you the wrong way. I see that now. Dot set the pages down on the desk. She sat for a long time without moving. Outside Claire's window, Nashville went about its Wednesday traffic, a siren somewhere distant. The ordinary sounds of a city that did not know or care what was happening on the third floor of this particular building. He had been afraid. He had been alone. He had signed. She picked up the final page. You will find this. I know you will because you are the most stubborn person I have ever loved, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. You stayed with patients when their families had given up. You stayed with me through years I didn't make easy. You do not stop. The paintings are worth something real. Claire can help you understand how much and what to do with them. But that isn't why I kept them. I kept them because they are the truest record I have of the life we built. Every landscape I painted, I was somewhere near home. Near you. I was always somewhere near you. Don't let anyone take them from you. I'm sorry I couldn't say more of this out loud. I tried to say it the only way I knew. I love you, George. Dot folded the letter along its original creases. She held it in both hands for a moment. The 7 pages, the blue ink, the handwriting that grew smaller and more compressed toward the end as his body ran out of what it needed to keep going. But his intention did not waver, not once, not on a single line. She had read it through completely. She would read it again later and again after that, and each time she would find something she had moved past too quickly, a word choice, a phrase, a place where he had started a sentence, and then stopped and started again, all of it visible in the ink. He had seen her. Not the version of her that other people described, the capable one, the steady one, the one who always knew what to do. The actual her. The one who was tired sometimes and wrong sometimes, and had trusted the wrong people because she had spent her whole life surrounded by people worth trusting. That was the person he had written to. She knocked on the door to let Claire know she was ready. He had seen her. Even at the end, he had seen her exactly as she was. Raymond arrived without calling ahead, which told her everything she needed to know about how worried he actually was. A man who calls first is managing a situation. A man who simply appears has lost control of one. She saw the car from the kitchen window, dark blue BM. The same one Walter had described from 10 years ago, coming up the gravel drive slower than necessary, the way people drive when they are looking at something they expected to find different. She watched it park beside her rental car and did not move from the window. Raymond got out and stood for a moment with his hand still on the door. He looked at the farmhouse, the windows clean smoke from the kitchen chimney, her car in the drive. He looked at the barn door closed, new lock visible even from this distance. He looked at the fence line recently cleared. He looked at all of it with the particular attention of a man doing arithmetic. Then he came to the door and knocked. Dot opened it. She did not smile. She did not step back to invite him in. She simply stood in the doorway and looked at her son, his jaw, his posture, the way he held himself. That was George's way and wasn't the copy that had gotten some things right and others badly wrong. Mom. His voice was calibrated. Concerned son, reasonable man, entirely in control. I've been worried. You haven't been returning calls. I've been busy, she said. Come inside. She made coffee the way she always had, same order, same motions, because it gave her hands something to do, and because it told him nothing had changed while everything had. She set 2 mugs on the kitchen table and sat down across from him. Raymond looked at her the way he had looked at the property assessing. She placed the document on the table between them. He looked down. She watched his face as he recognized what it was, the 2023 will, Claire's cover letter clipped to the front, the date visible in the upper right corner of the first page. His expression did not collapse. He was too controlled for that, too practiced. But his right hand, resting on the table, pressed flat against the wood. Where did you get this? Not what is this? Not I don't understand. He knew exactly what it was. The question was how far it had traveled and who was holding it now. From Claire Ashworth, Dot said. The attorney your father retained in 2013 and paid every year for 11 years. A silence. Raymond sat back slightly, a movement so small most people would have missed it. Dot did not miss it. She had spent 38 years reading the small movements. We can discuss the legal situation, he said carefully. We can, she agreed. But first I want to tell you something. She told him about Sasha the way she would have told a family member about a diagnosis, directly, completely, in the order the facts occurred. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his face. November 2022. Sasha coming to the house alone. The document she brought. The threat she made. George in the 3rd round of chemotherapy, tired in the way that went past, tired into something without a word for it. The signature. She watched Raymond's face as she spoke. He was good at composure. She had always known that about him, the lawyer's training, the careful management of expression, the habit of revealing nothing until he had decided what to reveal. But this was different from receiving news he had prepared for. This was information arriving from a direction he had not accounted for, and his face showed it the way a wall shows water, not immediately, but by degrees, the surface changing before the structure did. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved not to her, but to a point on the table just past the document, the unfocused look of a mind running through a sequence of events and arriving somewhere it didn't expect. She kept going. She gave him every fact in order, and she watched his face the entire time. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Raymond's right hand was still flat on the table. He had not touched his coffee. She didn't tell me, he said. Not that's not true. Not you're mistaken. Not any of the responses of a man who had known and was choosing to deny it. Just she didn't tell me. The voice of someone stating a fact they were still in the process of believing. He hadn't known. She could see it. He genuinely hadn't known. She did not forgive him for this. He had spent years mapping his father's estate, calculating what could be taken, and how letting his mother leave Columbus with $47 and a rental car without a word of protest. The fact that his wife had gone further than he intended did not reach back and undo any of that. But she was a nurse, and nurses did not ignore symptoms because they appeared in people they didn't like. The symptom was real. Raymond had not known. That was simply true, and she noted it the way she noted everything accurately, without embellishment, without letting it mean more than it meant. A long silence settled over the kitchen. Outside, the October fields were flat and bright. A crow moved across the far tree line and disappeared. The barn sat solid and unchanged at the back of the property, its new lock catching the afternoon light, the same way it had caught it, the first morning she arrived. Raymond looked up from the table. Something in his face had shifted, not softened exactly, but reorganized the way a room looks different after you move one piece of furniture and suddenly understand why it had always felt slightly wrong. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "What I should have done 3 months ago," she said. "Talk to a lawyer." She poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on the counter. She set one in front of her son. He didn't touch it. She drank hers slowly and waited for him to decide what kind of man he was going to be. The night before the hearing, Dot sat at the kitchen table in Millhaven and went through the list of what they had. Claire had been direct with her that afternoon, the way Dot had always preferred people to be direct. The 2023 will was valid and properly executed. But proving Sasha had coerced George into signing the 2021 version was a different problem. George's letter described the November visit in detail. The document Sasha brought the threat she made, the exhaustion that had made him sign. The letter was powerful. It was also the account of one person written alone with no one else in the room. Sasha's attorney had already filed a response, arguing the 2021 will was signed by a man of sound mind, which was technically correct. He had been of sound mind. He had also been 3 rounds into chemotherapy and alone in the house on an afternoon when he should not have been alone, but sound mind and undue influence were different arguments, and the second one required more than a letter. Without a witness to the November visit, Claire had said carefully the coercion argument was difficult. Dot sat with that word. Difficult. In 38 years of nursing, she had learned that difficult was the word people used when they meant possibly impossible, but I don't want to say that yet. The clock on the kitchen wall read 11 when her phone rang. Walter. "I've been thinking," he said without greeting, which was how Walter began most conversations. "About November 2022. Dot set down her pen. "George asked me something years back. After the man in the BMW came, he asked me to write down the license plates of any cars I didn't recognize at the property any time I saw a vehicle I couldn't account for." A pause. "I kept a notebook. I've kept it since he asked me. Walter. In November 2022, there was a car I didn't know, parked on the county road just past the gate. I wrote it down. Do you still have the notebook? I don't throw things away," he said. "Never have." Dot closed her eyes for a moment. George had asked Walter to keep records years before he needed them, the same way he had paid Claire's retainer, the same way he had changed the lock and left the key and sealed the letter and put the brass key on a ring where she would find it. Building walls quietly, one small brick at a time, against a threat he had hoped would never arrive. "Can you be in Nashville tomorrow morning?" she asked. "I'll leave at 6, Walter said, and hung up. The courtroom was smaller than she expected, which somehow made everything feel more real. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, the worn practicality of a room where ordinary people brought their most difficult problems, and a stranger in a robe decided them. Dot sat at the plaintiff's table with Claire. Raymond sat in the back row alone. Sasha sat on the opposite side with her attorney, a sharp-suited man who had the manner of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses and the expression of someone who had seen every variation of family dispute and was not easily moved by any of them. Sasha's attorney presented first. The 2021 will valid signature proper witnesses notarized. George Calloway had been of sound mind. The 2023 will, he argued, had been executed under undue influence from a third party, meaning Claire, and should be set aside. Claire responded without raising her voice. She called Walter to the stand. He came in from the hallway in his canvas jacket. The same jacket he wore to feed chickens and fix fence posts and sit in folding chairs in gravel driveways. He reached into the breast pocket and produced a small spiral notebook, blue cover, soft at the corners, the kind that cost less than $2 at any hardware store. He found the page. He read the license plate number into the record in the same steady voice he used for everything. Claire presented the vehicle registration, a 2019 Lexus, registered to Sasha Calloway. The plate placed Sasha's car at the Millhaven property in November 2022. George's letter described what had happened during that visit. The 2023 will had been drafted and signed in Claire's office on the same afternoon. George had written the letter the same afternoon, the same pen witnessed by two staff members who were both present and both testified. A man who wrote a letter describing coercion and then immediately executed a new will in an attorney's office, witnessed and notarized, was not a man acting under confusion. He was a man correcting a wrong while he still had time to correct it. Sasha's attorney asked for a recess. The judge looked at him over her reading glasses. "Denied," she said. The attorney tried a different approach. Presence at the property proved nothing about what had been said there. A car in the vicinity was not evidence of coercion. Claire read the relevant passage from George's letter into the record. She read it once at normal pace without theatrical emphasis. She let the words do what words do when they are true and specific, and written by a man who knew he was running out of time. She told me that if I didn't sign it, she would tell Raymond everything about Millhaven, and Raymond would find a way to take the property before I died. The courtroom was very quiet. Then Raymond stood up. He was in the back row, and he stood without warning, without consulting anyone, without the preliminary shift in posture that announces an intended movement. He simply stood, and the room registered it, the way rooms register unexpected things, a collective stillness, a reorientation of attention. Raymond stood up. No one had expected that. His own attorney turned and put a hand on Raymond's arm. Raymond moved it aside, a small, decisive gesture, the kind that ends an argument before it begins. "I'd like to address the court," he said. The judge looked at him for a moment. "You may." He spoke for 4 minutes. He described the Tuesday in 2013 when he had driven to Millhaven in his dark blue BMW and stood at the gate while his father crossed his arms and said very little. He described what he had been planning methodically, without self-serving softening, in the direct language of a lawyer who understood that partial truths were worse than silence in a courtroom. He said he had not known about Sasha's visit. He said his mother had a right to what her husband had left her, and that the 2023 will reflected his father's actual intentions, and that he would not contest it. He sat down. He did not look toward the seat where Sasha had been. She had waited. She had documented. She had not given up. The judge ruled in favor of the 2023 will. The property, the accounts, the house in Columbus, all of it reverted to Dorothy Calloway as the rightful heir under the controlling instrument. She noted for the record that the evidence of coercion was substantial, and that the court took a serious view of attempts to manipulate estate documents from vulnerable individuals. Sasha left through a side door before the ruling was complete. Raymond sat very still in the back row. Dot gathered her documents into the folder Claire had prepared, straightened the edges, and clipped it closed. She stood, shook Claire's hand, and walked toward the exit. At the door, she stopped. She looked back at her son, this man she had raised, this man who had taken everything she and George had built together and put it in a folder and laid it on a kitchen table, this man who had just stood up in a courtroom and told the truth when it cost him something real. He was not a good man who had become good. He was a man who had done one good thing at the right moment. She held his gaze for a moment. She did not smile. She did not look away. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked out the front entrance into the November light and breathed. She breathed. That was enough for now. Lily called at 9:30 that night, which meant she had been sitting with the phone in her hand for hours. Dot was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She hadn't drunk the folder from the hearing still in front of her, the house quiet. In the way it had been quiet since she arrived, not empty, just still. She heard her phone on the counter and looked at the name on the screen and picked it up. "Mom?" Lily's voice broke on the single syllable. Not dramatically, just the small, honest fracture of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had finally stopped. Dot said nothing. She waited. This was not coldness. It was the same thing she had done at bedsides for 38 years. The deliberate, respectful silence that said, "I am here and I am listening, and I will not fill this space before you're ready to fill it yourself." Lily cried for a moment. Then she began to talk. She had heard Raymond mention the farm in the spring of 2020, a phone call. She had not been meant to hear something about their father's assets, a property in Tennessee, before anything happens. She had understood what she was hearing. She had told herself she didn't know the specifics, that she wasn't involved in whatever Raymond was planning, that not knowing the details was the same as not being part of it. "It wasn't the same thing," Dot said. A silence. "No," Lily said. "It wasn't." Dot stood up from the table and moved to the kitchen window. Outside, the yard was dark beyond the reach of the porch light. The barn was a shape in the darkness, solid, present, invisible. "Do you know what your silence cost me?" she asked. "Yes." Lily's voice was small. "I don't think you do." "Not fully." Dot kept her voice level, the voice she used when the truth needed to be heard clearly and embellishment would only get in its way. It wasn't Raymond taking the house that hurt most. It wasn't the car or the accounts. Those things I can replace some of them in time. She paused. It was reading your father's letter in a lawyer's office in Nashville with no one beside me, sitting in that room alone and finding out everything he had been carrying, everything he had been afraid of, everything he had tried to fix before he ran out of time. Alone, Lily, with a stranger's secretary, bringing me a glass of water, because she could see I needed something, and there was no one else there to bring it. The line was quiet. "That is what I can't undo quickly," Dot said. "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Lily said. "Not a defense, not a qualification, just the word and the weight of it." They stayed on the line in silence for a moment, mother and daughter 1,000 miles apart, sitting with the specific shape of what had been done and what it had cost. Then Lily said, "Can I come?" Dot looked at the barn, 247 canvases on their shelves. 40 years of her husband's quiet attention, his careful noticing the life he had lived alongside their life without ever finding the words to show her. All of it waiting in the dark behind a locked door she had opened alone. "You can come," she said, "but not to feel better about yourself. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" "Your father painted 247 pictures over 40 years, and no one ever saw them." She turned from the window. "I'm going to change that. I need help. Real help cataloging research phone calls, driving all of it. Work." She paused. "That's what coming here means. Do you understand?" A silence. Different from the earlier silences, not the silence of someone deciding what to say, but the silence of someone deciding who they were going to be. "Yes," Lily said. "I understand. Come Saturday. Bring clothes you can work in." She hung up and stood at the window for a long time. The kitchen light reached the porch, reached the edge of the yard, and stopped. Beyond it, the barn held its darkness, patient, unchanged, full of everything that still needed to happen. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Work first. The door was open. It had always been open. She just needed Lily to walk through it carrying something. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. For the first time since George died, she fell asleep quickly. She hung up and looked out at the barn in the dark. 247 paintings. Her husband's whole hidden life. It would take time to bring them into the light. That was all right. She had time now. The gallery was smaller than a school gymnasium, which felt exactly right. It was a converted storefront on a side street in Nashville, exposed brick, good natural light from the north-facing windows, the kind of space that had been a pharmacy, and then a print shop, and then nothing for 2 years, before someone with taste and not much money turned it into this. Claire had known the owner. Lily had spent 3 weeks on the phone and in spreadsheets getting the logistics right. Walter had driven up from Millhaven on the Thursday before, arriving at 7 in the morning with his truck and his tools and no announcement, and had spent 2 days helping hang the work. 20 paintings, selected from 247. No opening event, no press release, no champagne and no speeches. Just a sign in the window, and the doors open at 10 on a Saturday morning in December, and whatever happened after that. The exhibition title was painted in small letters on the wall beside the entrance. The Quiet Work. Paintings by George Calloway. 1979 to 2019. Dot had chosen the title on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table in Millhaven, turning through her notebook from the barn. She had tried other titles and discarded them. Then she remembered something Walter had said on the first afternoon when she was still standing in the gravel, looking at a lock she didn't yet understand. George was always working at something quiet. That was it. That had always been it. By 11 o'clock, people had begun to come in from the street, drawn by the window display Lily had arranged, or by nothing more than the open door and the quality of the light inside. They moved through the room slowly, the way people move when something asks them to slow down. A few spoke quietly to each other. Most were silent. Dot stood near the entrance for the first hour, not greeting people exactly, just present the way she had learned to be present in rooms where something important was happening, and her job was not to direct it, but to hold the space. A woman about her age stopped in front of the 2009 painting. The Winter Creek black water between snow-covered banks, the one George had labeled Stones Creek in February. The water was low this year. She stood there for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to Dot. "Did you know him?" "He was my husband," Dot said. The woman nodded slowly. "My husband used to build things. Little wooden boxes, nothing fancy. I found 2 crates of them in the garage after he passed." She looked back at the painting. "I didn't know either." They stood together in front of George's Winter Creek and did not say anything else because nothing else was needed. Lily found her at noon. They stood side by side in front of the 1987 painting, the Tennessee hillside, the amber light across the ridge, the first canvas Dot had ever lifted from the shelf, while Walter stood in the doorway and gave her space. It hung in the center of the room, and below it, on a small card, Dot had written herself, George Calloway. Plumber, father, husband, painter. That order was deliberate. She had thought about it for a long time before she wrote it down. Lily looked at the card, then at the painting. Then she reached over and took her mother's hand and held it, and Dot let her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the painting hadn't already said better. Walter arrived near closing time. He came through the door carrying his folding chair, the same canvas chair he had carried across the fence line on the first afternoon, the one he set up in the gravel and poured coffee from without asking permission. He was 3 steps inside the gallery before he seemed to register where he was, and then he stopped and looked at the chair in his hand and laughed a short, quiet laugh of genuine surprise at himself. He set the chair against the wall near the entrance and walked the room alone. He moved slowly, stopping at each painting, spending time with each one the way he spent time with most things, without hurry, without performance, simply giving it his full attention until he was ready to move on. He stopped in front of a large landscape near the center of the room, a wide field at early morning. The grass silver with dew, the sky still pale at the horizon, the light arriving slowly from the east. A painting that asked you to stand still and breathe. Dot watched him looking at it. "I know this field," he said. She came to stand beside him. He was quiet for a moment. "This is the view from my kitchen window." He looked at it for a long time, at the particular angle of the light, the exact position of the fence line at the far edge. "All these years I thought he was just standing at my fence looking out." His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of someone arriving at something slowly. "I thought he was just thinking." The gallery had gone quiet around them. The last visitors were moving toward the door. The afternoon light was fading in the north-facing windows. He had been watching all along. He just hadn't known how to say it out loud. George Calloway had stood at Walter's fence and at Dot's window, and at the edge of every ordinary thing he loved, and he had looked, really looked the way most people never find the time to look. And then he had gone to his barn and put what he saw onto canvas and sealed it and kept it and waited for the right person to find it. He had been paying attention his entire life. He had just never learned to say, "Look what I see when I look at you." Near the end of the day, when the gallery was nearly empty, and the owner was beginning to quietly straighten things near the back, Dot stood alone in front of the 1987 painting. The hillside, the amber light. G. Calloway, 1987. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small brass key, the one she had worn on her wrist for 3 months, without knowing what had opened, the one that had unlocked the metal box, the one that had started everything. She turned it once in her fingers. The lock was open. The box was open. The barn was open. The letter had been read. The will had been heard. The paintings were on the walls where people could see them. Everything the key had guarded was already in the light. She leaned forward and placed it on the windowsill beside the painting gently, without ceremony, the way you set down something you have been carrying for a long time and no longer need to carry. She stepped back. She looked at the painting one more time, the light George had chased across a Tennessee hillside in the year their children were small, the light he had driven 4 hours to find and 4 hours to return from, the light he had never once mentioned over dinner. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, in the small gallery on the side street in Nashville, 20 paintings waited in the quiet, the first 20 of 247, the first 247 of 40 years. 40 years of a man who had loved the world around him more than he knew how to say. She left the key on the windowsill next to the 1987 painting and walked out into the December light. Behind her, George Calloway's quiet work remained finally after all these years seen. Have you ever discovered something about someone you loved? Something they kept not to deceive you, but because they didn't know how to show it? Leave a comment below. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more waiting.